Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is 18th of December. Today we're doing a front update primarily focusing on Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. We're going to look at the territorial changes in those regions, and we're not going to be doing that much analysis of these parts of the front line. More so I'm going to be focusing on the facts on the ground, just looking at the updates. So I do really apologize for that, but it's due to the fact that I haven't uploaded for really nearly a week now, so I need to go over all of those changes. And starting off, we're going to look at Novomykhailivka, where the Russian forces have been able to advance and take over this polygon generally over here. So the Russian forces have been able to clear out additional Ukrainian fortifications located in tree lines south of Novomykhailivka, where they had spent really over a year building up trenches and laying minefields, which is a large component of why the Russian forces struggled in advancing through this region when they launched attacks in the early days of October. But now the Russian forces have succeeded in clearing out these fields over here where I'm going over with these red lines. So they've been able to clear out the Ukrainian controlled tree lines and trenches built up in those regions. And several days ago, Rybar, they claimed that elements of Russia's 68th Army Corps were able to establish positions within the southern outskirts of Novomykhailivka itself, near this agricultural enterprise and within the cemetery. And at the time, there was no actual visual evidence to back it up. And Deep State's map, it still shows these two areas where I have the red rectangle showing them as within the gray zone. But we have this video which was released by the Ukrainian side on December 17th. It shows Ukrainian drones and they drop grenades onto the Russian forces located in trenches on Novomykhailivka's southern outskirts. So this is an area that was highly fortified by the Ukrainians, not just in the open areas, but also in between houses within agricultural facilities. And now at least some of those fortifications in the southernmost part of the village are beginning to be taken over by the Russian forces. They've now established an actual foothold that could allow them to enter the village of Novomykhailivka itself. But the reason why they've not entered so far is due to the density of mines in the area in between the line of contact and the Ukrainian defenses that are located within the village, the residential areas of the village. And you do have a lot of defenses within the residential areas because basically in every single backyard and really in a lot of these different areas in between houses, you do have trenches that were built up, especially on the eastern outskirts of Novomykhailivka, which is where we're going to look next. This area over here where I have the line of contact marked is extremely fortified by the Ukrainians, and that's also part of why the Russians have not assaulted this region head on as much as they have southwards. But at the same time, the Russian forces are heavily bombarding Ukrainian positions on the eastern outskirts of this village. So when I mean the eastern outskirts, I mean, for instance, this tree line over here. There's been heavy, actually FPV drone strikes on Ukrainian forward positions within this trench located in the tree line and in some of these houses that are pretty close to the line of contact. You also have a lot of TOS-1A shelling of the Ukrainian forces, so they are under severe bombardment, not just within the village, but also further westwards in some of the villages that are supplying the Ukrainian unit, the 79th Air Assault Brigade, defending in Novomykhailivka. So you've had some strikes around Konstantinivka, for example. While the battles rage in Novomykhailivka, a part of the front line that is really just as important is also really in the news recently due to some movement on the front line, and that's the area just to the north of Novomykhailivka. So the Russian forces, they took advantage of their advances within Maryinka itself that have been occurring over the past several weeks, which we're going to get to in a second. They've used those newly acquired positions to consolidate control over Maryinka's southern flank along these open fields and along this local road over here leading into Pobieda. And the goal by doing that is to isolate Pobieda and then eventually take it over. But for now, they're bypassing Pobieda and advancing through Ukrainian fortified positions and open fields located to the east of that village and to the north of Novomykhailivka. So during the past several days, the Russian forces have advanced what I believe is like 1.5 kilometers when I last measured it. It actually looks something like this when you measure it with a measuring stick. And so there was a Russian advance in this region led mainly by the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment. That's the unit that was mentioned. And they were able to take over this Ukrainian fortified agricultural center. And another very key fortification for the Ukrainian forces in this region was a former animal farm called Zverinets. This is the name of the Ukrainian fortification, located on a height that overlooks some of the fields in this region. So it is a good observation point for Ukrainian forward positions, looking at Russian infantry and vehicles that are advancing along these roads. And so the Russian forces, they have not assaulted it head on based on the mapping in this region. They've actually bypassed it from the north, advancing along this local road and took over this other fortification. And so now the Russian forces have cut off really some of the access that the Ukrainian forces had to supplying their forward garrison in Zverenets. And so the status of that fortified system is now sort of dubious over the past few days as the Russian forces have been making some advances in this region. And by doing so, they've actually taken over control of key heights that are overlooking several Ukrainian positions. For instance, the ones in Pobieda are being overlooked by the newly taken Russian controlled fields to the east of that village. And also, by virtue of the Russians advancing, they've also been able to take heights overlooking Novomykhailivka, which is located on a valley. Now, looking at Maryinka, the Russian forces continue their advance in the northwestern section of that village. And what you see if you zoom in is the Russian forces have been able to advance several hundred meters over the past few days, amounts to something like 400 meters. And the Ukrainians are resisting every single Russian advance. They're fighting tooth and nail. You had the Ukrainian forces from the 79th Air Assault Brigade that are also defending in Maryinka, organize their forces that are located within Horlivka, and launched a pretty significant counterattack using infantry fighting vehicles and then dismounting some of their forces within certain houses in Ivano-Frankovsk streets. And there's a geolocated video of that over here. So you had the counterattack launched by the Ukrainian side. The Russian artillery responded and targeted the Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicles and troops that were taking up positions within these houses along this road. And the attack was eventually repelled, leading to Ukrainian casualties. And again, that does show why it is such an arduous process to clear out every single one of these blocks. But in terms of looking at the administrative boundaries of Maryinka that are under Ukrainian control, it looks something like this. But looking at the broader picture, what's important is the Ivano-Frankovsk street that leads into Horlivka and the road south of this pond, which also leads into that village Horlivka, which the Russian forces are now trying to consolidate control over. Now, looking at Avdiivka on the city's southern flank, there are a few changes to the map that have been confirmed by pro-Ukrainian source Deep State that I'm going to go over. So this occurred on the 17th of December. You had a minor Russian advance amounting to basically this polygon over here, which is a minor advance through the main road of Vodiane leading into Prvomaiske. Then around Severine, I did edit the map to indicate that there is a heightened Russian presence on the fields and tree lines that flank Severine from basically the southwest and southeast. So this polygon over here, a lot of it's been under Russian control, or at least a partial Russian presence for several weeks. But now there is confirmation based on the Ukrainian sources that there was an advance of the Russian forces into this polygon over here. So it is a minor Russian advance trying to gradually take over additional territory on Severine's flanks to increase pressure onto that forward position, but also onto Tonenke, which is basically this hub that leads into Severine and then into the southern outskirts of Avdiivka itself, where the Ukrainians are still heavily defending against the Russian attacks. And then there's also this minor Russian advance, which occurred just to the southeast of Severine, taking control of parts of this tree line over here, and then also basically taking off additional pressure off of Russian positions in this quarry area and off of their positions in Opitny by advancing through some of the open fields located just to the northwest of the village of Opitny. And so that's the totality of those advances. Now, looking at the residential areas of Avdiivka, there is finally confirmation of a Russian foothold located within the southern outskirts of some of these streets where there are houses present. This was basically a claim made by pro-Russian sources for about a week now, and I haven't reported it as fact due to the lack of evidence, but now there is evidence, so of course I'm editing the map. In terms of the Russian vector of attack, you can see that they advance along Yasonovsky Lane over here to enter into some of the houses. And they also likely advance through the forested areas, some of the paths through that forest with a pretty substantial amount of forces because we saw Ukrainian FPV drone videos of the Russian forces advancing through these forested paths. And we see that it's not just like 2 or 3 men, in some cases like 10 men or a dozen, and they're all advancing in tandem through the forest towards the positions that were previously occupied by the Ukrainians and are now Russian controlled within these parts of the residential area of Avdiivka. So basically within this polygon over here, that's the extent of the Russian advances, although we don't have visual evidence to prove it, but there are claims of a Russian presence in other roads such as Kolosova Street and even deeper into the entire gray zone in this region. And in response, you have the FPV drone unit of the Ukrainian 110th Mechanized Brigade hitting Russian forces in the forested areas, but also as they were entering into the houses. So in terms of the topography, just quickly going over it, the Russian forces do have the height advantage in this region, both within the Promka Industrial District and within the rural dachas to the south of it, which overlook the Ukrainian positions that they're defending in the valleys that are located in the residential areas the Russian forces are now entering. Looking at Avdiivka's northern flank, there are fierce battles going on in and around Stepove, but especially around the northern flank of Stepove. This part of the front line has really begun to increase in intensity over the past few days. So on December 12th, it was reported by Deep State that the Russian forces were able to take advantage of their newly acquired positions on the rail line and on the tree lines running parallel to that rail line. So basically in this region over here, they use their forward positions around here to advance past the rail line and into Ukrainian controlled fields and tree lines, and took over this tree line over here, which is very important in terms of securing the northern flank of Stepove. So now the Russian forces have control over this region and are putting pressure not just directly to the east of Stepove, but also from the northern flank especially. And so you're seeing a new Russian vector of pressure onto the Ukrainian defenders in that region. And as a result, a lot of Stepove is now a gray zone. You do have a lot of back and forth, but the Russian forces have improved their positions around that village. And not just around that village, but also to the north of it. They've also advanced along the rail line and along the tree lines, even further north along this vector of attack, as was proven in a video released by the Ukrainian Korn Group, which is a FPV drone unit of the 116th Mechanized Brigade, where they hit Russian infantry in this rail line area over here, which confirms a minor Russian advance. I'll mark it on the map. This was basically the extent of the Russian advance along that same tree line as they continue to take over the heights that are located in the fields in between those two rail lines that are branching out in this intersection over here. Now looking at the Horlivka front, on the 12th of December, the Ukrainian side posted a video of the 24th Mechanized Brigade taking control of a spoil heap that overlooks Russian positions in the village of Pivdenia. So here's the 24th. It was previously fighting on the southern flank of Bakhmut, so the movement of that unit is pretty interesting given the state of affairs over there. And here we have a marking on the map of where the Ukrainian forces were able to take control of that spoil heap. And during that operation, they also were able to take 5 Russian troops prisoner and raise their flag. And the following day, there was a video released by the Russian side, which shows their own soldiers taking control of that same Ukrainian flag that was raised over the spoil heap. And again, taking control of that same position. So now the Ukrainians, all their gains that have been made over the past month or so in the area to the north of Horlivka, around a lot of these spoil heaps that have been heavily fortified by the Russian side, a lot of those gains, basically all of them at this point, besides some advances around the village of Pivdenia itself, have been reversed as the Russian forces have retaken those spoil heaps that are extremely important as they overlook the Russian positions in Pivdenia, as I said, as they're located on a local height. And so now it's going to be very interesting to see what the Ukrainian forces do with their men that are located in the 24th Mechanized Brigade as we move on to the Bakhmut front. Looking at Klishchiika, there is a video that's pretty old. It's from December 11th, and it shows a Ukrainian battalion from the Presidential Brigade, which is one of the units defending on the wider Bakhmut front. And their FPV drones strike Russian positions in trenches and ditches located on height 215.7, which is the height that's been heavily contested by the Russian and Ukrainian forces alike, as it overlooks the Ukrainian positions located in this valley within Klishchiika. And by virtue of the Russian forces having presence in that area and their aspiration would be to take it over, they would be able to significantly increase the pressure and the firepower on a local scale aimed at the Ukrainian positions in that valley, which would make holding onto those positions much more difficult and yield far more casualties. And so the confirmation of the Russian presence on this height is now geolocated, which means that I've adjusted the map accordingly. Although we don't have information about the full capture of the height, so it seems like the rest of the area in the southern and western parts of this height that I have marked in light blue are likely contested at the moment. Now looking at the area directly to the west of Bakhmut, the Russian forces have spent the past week starting to clear out the Ukrainian defensive positions, a lot of fortifications that were built to the west of Kromova specifically, and also to the north of the village. and a lot of those are located within the Popivske region. It's the name of this Ukrainian defensive complex, which includes several houses, heights, and trenches that are, again, as I said before, west of Kremove. So now the Russian forces are clearing it out. They've advanced to the west of Kremove in recent days, although it was a minor advance, and they're also advancing directly into the trench areas, but there is still not full confirmation of Russian control over the trenches around the great car racing track over here. And that's due to a video released by the Russian side, I believe on December 17th, which shows their drones dropping grenades onto Ukrainian infantry that are located within those trenches. This is extremely interesting because a large portion of the Ukrainian defenders that were in these trenches, they either retreated or were forced to withdraw due to the heavy fighting. And what we're seeing here is that there is still a forward element of Ukrainian forces, albeit in very small quantities, that are holding on to their positions. They may be acting as a vanguard force as the rest of the Ukrainian forces are taking up positions several kilometers westwards in some of the heights around Kalinina, as we talked about in previous videos, and to the south of Bodanivka. So for now, there is still no confirmation of the full control of the Popivske fortification area by the Russian forces. Another area where there's still a lot of ambiguity actually is this area over here, which is also an extension of those same Ukrainian fortifications. Now, looking at the area to the north of Soledar, there is a change that I never mentioned, but it's from December 10th, so a while ago. And this is a Russian advance that occurred in the area just to the northwest, you could say, of villages such as Horlivka, Nahirnie, and Berestove. There was a Russian advance which occurred along this rail line and along some of the open fields in this region. And by virtue of these advances, the Russian forces were able to relieve some of the pressure that the Ukrainian forces were putting onto the village of Berestove and onto the highway, which actually leads further south. I believe it starts in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and then ends all the way in Bakhmut itself. And so the Russian forces can now use this road more freely than before by virtue of these Russian advances. And at the same time, they were able to take over these key heights that are overlooking the Ukrainian positions located in the valley of Vesele. And just a quick word about the front line over here. I do think it is a bit inaccurate as I've looked at the maps by both the pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian sources. I think my mapping overestimated the Russian control in this region over here. So I believe the front line that's more accurate would look something like this, where it is closer to Berestove, which would also explain why the Russian forces do want to relieve more pressure off of it and advance closer to Spirny and Avdiivka, where you do have significant Ukrainian fortifications on the Seversk salient. But unfortunately, I can't edit the Russian-controlled polygon in Donetsk Oblast due to a technical issue. So for now, you guys know the actual front line. And lastly, moving on to Synkivka, the Russian forces have been launching significant attacks with a large mechanized component advancing towards the northern outskirts of that village through their newly acquired positions in the forested areas located over here. They use those paths to advance all the way into the first houses, but despite numerous assaults, which started, I could say, around December 10th and really reached a climax around December 16th, with some pretty large mechanized assaults that were recorded on camera by the Ukrainian side and their drones, showing in some instances 10 vehicles, tanks, MTLBs, infantry fighting vehicles, all coming together on the same path towards the residential blocks. And in some instances, it was like 8, but still, those are pretty significant numbers on this part of the front line. And these attacks by the Russian side were largely unsuccessful in yielding any sort of territorial changes, and there was some material damage noted as shown in some of these geolocated videos, which I have not added to the map yet, but they are linked on other maps, so I'm going to add them right after this video to prove the geolocation. And so what we see in these videos, and a big explanation for why the Russian forces were not able to advance in these past several days, is due to the heavily mined nature of the fields in between the Russian positions in the forest and within Synkivka. And so that's been an issue. You've also had the Ukrainian response. You had the response from Ukraine's 30th Mechanized Brigade, a unit which was previously fighting to the north of Soledar, but it appears they were recently moved to the Kupiansk front, potentially due to the increased Russian pressure around here. And also from the Ukrainian 40th Artillery Brigade, another unit that was previously further south along the basically Luhansk front, but not this up north. So it seems like they've also been moved to this region to assist with artillery supports. And so we've seen some of their artillery strikes on Russian clusters of vehicles and troops. And also the 30th Mechanized Brigade, they have a strong drone component, which has been dropping grenades onto Russian infantry as they made their way into some of the open areas from the forests. And then you also had support from Ukrainian infantry that was conducting localized counterattacks whenever the Russian side would advance. And you also had javelins firing at Russian armor and some tanks that the Ukrainians would send to the front line from their own tank arsenal, and those would also be used to engage with the Russian forces. So for now, there's no actual changes within Synkivka, but the Russian forces have strengthened their positions just to the north of it and have opened up new routes to attack the northern outskirts of said village. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.